My husband Trevor thought he was so clever, systematically embezzling $400,000 from our family contracting business while creating a paper trail that would make it look like I was the one stealing from our clients and employees. But what he didn't know was that I had already discovered his elaborate scheme and had been feeding him false information for months, using the same surveillance and intelligence gathering skills the Army taught me during my 3 tours in Afghanistan. When he finally submitted his evidence to the FBI and tried to have me arrested for federal fraud charges, he got a very different kind of surprise than the comfortable retirement he was expecting while I rotted in prison. One that involved handcuffs, seized assets, and a federal investigation that would uncover a criminal network spanning 4 states. But let me start from the beginning, because the story of how I turned my husband's perfect frame job into his perfect downfall is one that took 8 months to unfold. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I've got another mind-blowing story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about trust. Every detail of what I'm about to share with you matters, because it shows how quickly the person closest to you can become your greatest enemy. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, retired. For 12 years, I thought I was living the American dream that every veteran hopes for when they transition back to civilian life. Picture this: a successful construction company based in Charlotte, North Carolina, specializing in government contracts and commercial developments. We had a beautiful brick colonial house in Myers Park, complete with a wraparound porch where Trevor and I would sit every evening, planning our future over sweet tea and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Mitchell & Associates Construction wasn't just a business to me. It was my life's work, my contribution to building something meaningful after spending 15 years serving my country in places most people only see on the evening news. I'd served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan, rising through the ranks from second lieutenant to lieutenant colonel, leading logistics operations that kept our forward operating bases supplied and our soldiers fed, armed, and protected. When an IED explosion in Kandahar left me with a permanently damaged left knee and a Purple Heart, I knew my military career was over, but I wasn't ready to stop serving my community. That's where the construction company came in. Using my military discipline, leadership experience, and the VA business loan program, I started Mitchell & Associates with a simple mission: provide honest, quality construction services while hiring fellow veterans who, like me, were struggling to find their place in the civilian world. We specialized in government contracts because I understood how to navigate federal procurement processes, and we expanded into commercial work because I knew how to manage complex projects and meet impossible deadlines. Trevor Walsh came into my life 5 years ago at a Veterans Day ceremony at the Charlotte Motor Speedway. He wasn't a veteran himself, but he was there supporting his brother Marcus, who had served 2 tours in Iraq with the Marines. Trevor was everything I thought I needed in a partner after years of military relationships that couldn't survive. The demands of deployment schedules and the constant threat of danger. He was stable, civilian, grounded in the kind of normal life I'd been dreaming about during those long nights in Afghan forward operating bases. Standing 6 feet tall with sandy brown hair and the kind of easy smile that made everyone around him feel comfortable, Trevor worked as a senior accountant for a regional banking firm. He was detail-oriented, financially savvy, and genuinely seemed to admire my military service and entrepreneurial ambitions. When he told me he wanted to help me build something lasting, something that would honor the sacrifice of veterans while creating opportunities for others, I thought I'd found my perfect partner in every sense of the word. Our courtship was everything my military relationships had never been: predictable, stable, and refreshingly normal. Trevor would pick me up for dinner dates in his meticulously maintained Honda Accord, always arriving exactly on time, always dressed appropriately for whatever restaurant he'd chosen. He listened intently when I talked about my military experiences, asked thoughtful questions about the challenges of transitioning to civilian life, and never once made me feel like my combat service was something to be minimized or forgotten. He was fascinated by my business, spending hours asking detailed questions about our contracts, our bidding processes, our employee management systems, and our financial structures. I was touched by his genuine interest in understanding every aspect of what I'd built. Here was a man who wanted to be involved, who appreciated the complexity of running a construction company, who understood that my business wasn't just about making money, but about creating something meaningful for the veteran community. When Trevor proposed to me 18 months after we met, he did it at the construction site of our biggest project at the time, a new community center for homeless veterans in downtown Charlotte. He got down on one knee right there in the dirt, surrounded by building materials and the skeletal frame of what would become a place of hope for struggling veterans, and asked me to marry him with a speech about building our future together, the same way we were building that center, with patience, dedication, and love. I said yes without hesitation. This man understood me, supported my mission, and wanted to be part of something bigger than himself. The ring was modest but thoughtful, a simple solitaire diamond that reflected his practical nature and respect for our shared values rather than his desire to impress anyone. Everything about Trevor felt genuine, solid, and trustworthy. Our wedding was exactly what both of us wanted, a small ceremony at Fort Bragg's historic chapel, attended by 50 of our closest friends and family members, followed by a reception at the Officers Club. My Army buddies who could make it came in their dress blues, Trevor's family drove down from Virginia, and Marcus gave a toast that brought tears to everyone's eyes as he talked about how grateful he was that his brother had found someone who understood the meaning of service and sacrifice. After our honeymoon in Asheville, Trevor moved into my house in Myers Park, and we began the process of truly blending our lives. He was respectful of my space, my routines, and my need to maintain certain aspects of the military discipline that had kept me alive and successful for 15 years. He admired my Oro 500 wake-up time, my daily physical training regimen, and my methodical approach to planning and executing both personal and professional objectives. More importantly, Trevor seemed genuinely committed to supporting Mitchell & Associates construction. He volunteered to help with our bookkeeping, claiming that his background in banking and accounting could help streamline our financial operations and potentially save us money on outside accounting services. He spent evenings and weekends learning our business systems, familiarizing himself with our contracts, and developing what he called optimization strategies for our cash flow management. I was grateful for his help and impressed by his dedication. Running a construction company while maintaining the relationships and reputation necessary to secure government contracts was exhausting work. Having a partner who understood finance and wanted to shoulder some of that burden felt like a gift. Trevor insisted he didn't want any official title or ownership stake in the company. He just wanted to help the woman he loved succeed in her mission of serving the veteran community. For the first 2 years of our marriage, everything seemed perfect. Our business grew from a small operation with 6 employees to a mid-sized company with 23 full-time workers, most of them veterans who had found new purpose and stability through the opportunities we provided. We completed projects for the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of Defense, and several major commercial developers throughout the Carolinas. Trevor's financial management seemed to be exactly what we needed. He implemented new accounting software, streamlined our invoicing processes, and created detailed financial reports that helped me understand our profit margins and growth potential better than ever before. Our bank accounts showed steady growth, our contracts were consistently profitable, and our employees were well paid and happy. But more than the business success, I treasured the personal happiness Trevor brought to my life. After years of military, relationships defined by separation, uncertainty, and the constant awareness that every goodbye might be permanent, I had found someone who came home to me every evening, who was interested in the mundane details of my day, who wanted to plan vacations and discuss retirement dreams, and debate whether we should renovate the kitchen or add a deck to the back of the house. Trevor made me feel normal in the best possible way. Not normal as in ordinary or forgettable, but normal as in safe, stable, and surrounded by the kind of love that grows stronger with time, rather than fading under the pressure of external circumstances. He celebrated my military achievements, proudly displaying my commendation medals and Purple Heart in our living room, and he bragged to his friends and family about my business success in a way that made me feel genuinely appreciated rather than patronized. On quiet Sunday mornings, we would sit on our back porch with coffee and the Charlotte Observer, discussing local news and planning our week ahead. Trevor would review our business calendar, making suggestions about scheduling and reminding me of important deadlines or meetings. He had a gift for seeing the big picture while managing the small details, and I genuinely believed that our partnership was making both of us better people and more successful professionals. During our 3rd year of marriage, we started talking seriously about expanding the business and maybe starting a family. Trevor encouraged me to bid on larger federal contracts, arguing that our reputation and track record qualified us for projects that could transform us from a regional company into a major player in government construction. He spent hours researching potential opportunities, analyzing bid requirements, and helping me prepare proposals that showcased our capabilities and commitment to excellence. I felt incredibly fortunate to have found someone who not only supported my dreams, but actively worked to help me achieve them. After 15 years in the military, where personal relationships often took a back seat to mission requirements, I had discovered the joy of true partnership. Trevor wasn't just my husband, he was my business collaborator, my strategic advisor, and my closest friend. What I didn't know then was that while I was falling deeper in love with the man I thought Trevor was, he was systematically studying every aspect of our business, our finances, and our legal vulnerabilities. What I didn't know was that his interest in our accounting systems and federal contracts wasn't motivated by love and support, but by greed and the kind of calculated criminal planning that would make my military intelligence training seem amateur. By comparison, what I didn't know was that Trevor had identified me as the perfect target for the most sophisticated fraud scheme I could have imagined. A decorated veteran with a successful government contracting business, substantial assets, and enough trust in her husband to give him access to everything he would need to destroy her life while making himself rich in the process. The man who made me feel safe, loved, and supported was actually studying me like a military strategist studies an enemy position, looking for weaknesses he could exploit and strengths he could turn into vulnerabilities. Every evening conversation about our business, every weekend spent reviewing contracts and financial reports, every suggestion he made about improving our operations was actually reconnaissance for the war he was planning to wage against me. But Trevor made one crucial mistake in his assessment of his target. He saw a trusting wife who had been trained to follow orders and respect authority. What he failed to recognize was that I had also been trained to gather intelligence, identify threats, and neutralize enemies who underestimated my capabilities. The same skills that had kept me alive in Afghanistan were about to give me everything I needed to turn his perfect crime into his perfect downfall. The first crack in Trevor's carefully constructed facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, about 6 months ago. I was in my home office at 5:30, reviewing bid specifications for a new Veterans Administration medical facility project in Raleigh, when I heard Trevor's phone buzzing incessantly from the kitchen counter downstairs. He was in the shower, and the persistent sound was disrupting my concentration as I worked through complex federal procurement requirements that demanded absolute attention to detail. After 5 minutes of nonstop buzzing, I walked downstairs to silence the phone, not intending to invade his privacy, but simply to restore the quiet I needed for focused work. The name on the screen made me pause. A. Riverside Development. The phone showed 17 missed calls from the same number, all within the past hour. This wasn't a casual business inquiry. This was someone desperately trying to reach my husband before normal business hours. When Trevor emerged from the bathroom, hair still damp and wearing his usual Tuesday outfit of khaki slacks and a blue button-down shirt, I mentioned the persistent caller. His reaction was subtle, but unmistakable to someone trained in reading micro-expressions and stress indicators. For just a fraction of a second, his face went completely blank, the kind of momentary freeze that happens when someone's brain is rapidly calculating how to respond to unexpected information. "Oh, that's Arthur Riverside," Trevor said, forcing his usual easy smile while reaching for his phone with movements that seemed just slightly too quick, too controlled. "He's a potential investor I've been talking to about some opportunities. Guy's on the West Coast, so he doesn't always remember the time difference. Probably calling about some market analysis I sent him last week." He grabbed his coffee mug and headed toward the garage, claiming he'd return the call from his car so he wouldn't disturb my work preparation. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace back and forth in our driveway for 25 minutes, his free hand gesturing frantically as he spoke. His body language was nothing like the calm, measured demeanor he maintained during normal business conversations. This looked like crisis management, damage control, or urgent coordination of something that required immediate attention. That afternoon, curiosity overcame my usual respect for his privacy. I searched Arthur Riverside Development online, expecting to find a legitimate investment firm or commercial development company. What I found instead was absolutely nothing. No corporate website, no business registration, no professional profiles, no mention in any business directories or real estate publications. For someone Trevor claimed was a serious investor interested in significant financial opportunities, Arthur Riverside had remarkably little digital presence. When Trevor returned home that evening, I casually asked about his conversation with Arthur Riverside, watching his reaction carefully while maintaining the casual tone of a supportive wife interested in her husband's professional activities. Trevor's response was smooth and confident, but I noticed he was unconsciously touching his wedding ring, rotating it around his finger in small, repetitive movements that I'd observed during past conversations when he was being less than completely truthful about minor issues. "Arthur's very private about his business operations," Trevor explained, settling into his usual spot on our living room couch while opening his laptop. "These high-level investors prefer to keep low profiles. They don't want their names and strategies plastered all over the internet where competitors can analyze their methods. He's involved in some very sensitive commercial real estate deals that require absolute discretion." The explanation was reasonable and delivered with Trevor's characteristic sincerity, but something about the entire interaction bothered me. Not enough to suggest serious deception, but enough to make me more observant about similar situations in the future. Military training teaches you to trust your instincts while gathering additional information before drawing conclusions. And my instincts were telling me to pay closer attention to Trevor's business communications. The second warning sign appeared 3 weeks later, during our monthly review of Mitchell & Associates' financial statements. Trevor had prepared his usual comprehensive analysis of our cash flow, profit margins, and projected expenses for the upcoming quarter. Everything looked excellent. Our contracts were performing ahead of schedule, our profit margins were healthy, and our employee payroll was well within budget parameters. However, when I cross-referenced Trevor's report with the bank statements I'd retrieved independently, I noticed discrepancies that didn't make sense. According to Trevor's analysis, we had $127,000 in our primary operating account. According to the bank's records, we actually had $89,000. The difference wasn't enormous, but it was significant enough to affect our ability to meet payroll obligations, if any of our current contracts experienced unexpected delays. When I pointed out the discrepancy, Trevor immediately produced a supplementary document showing several pending deposits from recently completed projects. He explained that his financial software automatically included confirmed receivables in cash flow projections, which accounted for the difference between his reports and the bank's current balance statements. He walked me through the calculations, step by step, showing how the pending payments would bring our actual account balance in line with his projections within the next 2 weeks. Again, his explanation was logical and professionally presented. Trevor's banking background made him far more sophisticated about financial management than I was, and I trusted his expertise in areas where my military training hadn't provided relevant knowledge. But I made a mental note to verify that the pending deposits actually materialized according to his timeline, and I decided to start reviewing our bank statements more regularly rather than relying entirely on Trevor's monthly summaries. The third incident occurred in early May during a dinner party we hosted for several of our employees and their families. It was an annual tradition I'd started to build camaraderie within our veteran workforce and show appreciation for their dedication to our mission. Trevor always enjoyed these gatherings, taking pride in his role as the supportive husband who helped create opportunities for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. During the evening, I was chatting with James Rodriguez, our lead project manager and a former Army sergeant who had served with me during my second deployment to Afghanistan. James mentioned something that stopped our conversation cold. "I really appreciate how you and Trevor worked out that bonus structure for the highway project. That extra payment really helped my family get caught up on some medical bills after Maria's surgery." I smiled and nodded, but internally I was completely confused. I had no knowledge of any special bonus structure for our highway construction contract. Our standard policy was to distribute performance bonuses at the end of each fiscal year, based on overall company profitability, not on individual project completion. When I asked James to clarify the details, he explained that Trevor had approached him privately the previous month, explaining that our highway contract had come in significantly under budget, allowing us to provide immediate bonuses to key employees rather than waiting for the annual review. The amount James mentioned was substantial, $3,200 for his role as project manager, with similar amounts distributed to 4 other senior employees. According to James, Trevor had presented this as a surprise I had authorized to show appreciation for exceptional work during a challenging project with tight deadlines and weather-related complications. Later that evening, after our guests had left and we were cleaning up, I asked Trevor about the highway project bonuses. His response was enthusiastic and detailed, praising the team's performance and explaining how our early completion and cost savings had created an opportunity to reward excellence immediately rather than waiting for our standard year-end process. He showed me documentation indicating that we had indeed finished the project $16,000 under budget, making the employee bonuses both affordable and well-deserved. Everything Trevor said made sense from a business perspective, and I was actually pleased that he had taken initiative to recognize our employees' hard work. My concern wasn't with the decision itself, but with the fact that such a significant financial commitment had been made without my knowledge or approval. Mitchell & Associates was my company, built with my VA loan and my military experience, and major financial decisions were supposed to require my authorization, regardless of how well-intentioned they might be. When I raised this concern, Trevor apologized sincerely, explaining that the opportunity had presented itself during a week when I was traveling to inspect a project site in Wilmington. He had tried to reach me by phone but couldn't get through due to poor cell service in the rural area where our project was located. Rather than lose the chance to reward our employees while their exceptional performance was fresh in everyone's mind, he had made the decision independently, planning to discuss it with me upon my return. His explanation addressed my immediate concerns, and his willingness to apologize for overstepping his authority seemed genuine. Trevor wasn't technically an employee or partner in Mitchell & Associates, but he had been handling our day-to-day financial management for over 2 years, and I had given him considerable autonomy in operational decisions. From his perspective, the employee bonuses probably seemed like a natural extension of the authority I had already granted him. Still, the incident marked a shift in my awareness of how much independent decision-making Trevor had assumed regarding our business operations. I realized that my trust and gratitude for his help had gradually evolved into a situation where he was essentially functioning as an unofficial business manager, with access to our accounts and authority to make significant financial commitments on behalf of the company. The fourth warning sign was the most subtle but ultimately the most revealing. In late May, I received a phone call from Linda Morrison, the procurement officer at the Charlotte VA Medical Center, regarding our bid submission for their new outpatient facility expansion. Linda and I had worked together on 3 previous projects, and she had always been impressed with our attention to detail and adherence to federal contracting requirements. "Sarah, I need to clarify something about your recent bid submission," Linda said, her tone professional but concerned. "The financial documentation you provided shows some irregularities that we need to resolve before we can move forward with the evaluation process." My stomach dropped. Federal contract bidding requires precise financial documentation, and any irregularities could not only disqualify us from the current project, but also raise questions about our eligibility for future government contracts. I asked Linda to specify the problems she had identified, preparing to take detailed notes and begin immediate corrective action. "Your profit and loss statements show income from several contracts that don't appear in our federal database," Linda explained. "Specifically, you're claiming revenue from projects with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the General Services Administration that we can't verify through normal channels." I was completely bewildered. Mitchell & Associates had never held contracts with HUD or GSA. Our government work was exclusively with the Department of Veterans Affairs and occasionally with the Department of Defense for small maintenance projects at regional military installations. I told Linda there must be some mistake, that we had never worked with the agencies she mentioned. "That's what I was afraid of," Linda said quietly. "Sarah, these discrepancies could indicate serious compliance issues. I'm required to report potential fraud indicators to the Inspector General's office. I wanted to call you directly first, because of our working relationship, but you need to understand that this is going to trigger a formal investigation." The phone call ended with my promise to investigate the documentation errors immediately and provide corrected information within 48 hours. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone, not from fear of legal consequences, but from complete confusion about how our bid submission could contain references to contracts that had never existed. I immediately called Trevor, explaining Linda's concerns and asking him to review the financial documents he had prepared for our VA bid submission. His response was calm and reassuring, suggesting that the problem was probably a simple software error where data from template documents had accidentally been included in our final submission. He promised to review everything immediately and prepare corrected documentation for my review before resubmission to Linda. That evening, Trevor presented me with revised financial statements that eliminated all references to the Phantom HUD and GSA contracts. He explained that our accounting software had indeed pulled information from proposal templates he had created for potential future bid submissions, accidentally including projected revenue from contracts we had never actually pursued. The error was embarrassing but easily correctable, and he apologized for not catching the mistake during his initial review process. I submitted the corrected documentation to Linda the following morning, along with a detailed explanation of the software, error, and assurance that our internal review processes would be strengthened to prevent similar mistakes in the future. Linda accepted our explanation and allowed our bid to continue through the evaluation process, though I could sense that her confidence in our professionalism had been somewhat diminished by the incident. More troubling than the immediate embarrassment was my growing realization that I had very little direct oversight of the financial documentation Trevor was preparing on behalf of Mitchell & Associates. I trusted his expertise and appreciated his assistance, but the VA incident made me understand that I needed to be more directly involved in reviewing all materials submitted under my company's name, regardless of how mundane or routine they might seem. That night, I lay awake thinking about the accumulating inconsistencies, the mysterious early morning phone calls, the unexplained discrepancies in our financial reports, the employee bonuses I hadn't authorized, and now the bid documentation errors that could have jeopardized our entire relationship with federal procurement officers. Individually, each incident had a reasonable explanation, but collectively they suggested a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. My military training had taught me that seemingly minor operational irregularities often indicated larger systemic problems that required immediate investigation and correction. What I was observing in my own home and business felt uncomfortably similar to the intelligence indicators we had been trained to recognize when assessing potential security threats in combat environments. I wasn't ready to conclude that Trevor was deliberately deceiving me, but I was definitely ready to start paying much closer attention to every aspect of our financial operations and his role in managing them. The woman who had survived 3 combat deployments by trusting her instincts while carefully gathering intelligence was about to start treating her own husband like a potential security risk. After the VA bid documentation incident, I made a decision that would fundamentally change the trajectory of our marriage and ultimately save my life's work. I decided to start conducting what the military calls passive surveillance on Trevor's activities, using the same intelligence-gathering techniques I had employed to identify insurgent networks and security threats during my deployments in Afghanistan. The first step was establishing baseline patterns of Trevor's normal behavior so I could identify deviations that might indicate deceptive activities. For 2 weeks, I carefully observed and documented his daily routines, noting the times he left for work, the duration of his lunch breaks, the frequency and timing of his phone calls, and the websites he visited when using our shared home computer. This wasn't paranoid behavior. This was methodical intelligence gathering designed to establish whether my growing concerns had legitimate foundations. What I discovered during those initial 2 weeks of observation was that Trevor's routine was far less predictable than I had previously realized. His job at Regional Trust Bank supposedly required him to be in the office from 8:30 in the morning until 5:30 in the evening, but his actual departure and arrival times varied significantly. Some days he left our house at 7:15, claiming early meetings with clients. Other days he didn't leave until 9:30, explaining that he was working from home during the morning to avoid traffic or complete projects requiring uninterrupted concentration. More concerning were the discrepancies between Trevor's claimed work schedule and the reality of his accessibility during business hours. When I called his office number during times when he should have been at his desk, I frequently reached his voicemail even though he hadn't mentioned any meetings or off-site appointments. When I asked about these missed calls during our evening conversations, Trevor always had plausible explanations: client meetings that had run longer than expected, training sessions for new banking software, or collaborative projects that required him to work in conference rooms where phone calls might be disruptive. The pattern of unexplained absences became more pronounced during my 3rd week of observation. On Wednesday, Trevor left the house at 7:45, claiming he needed to arrive early for a presentation to the bank's board of directors about new commercial lending strategies. When I called his office at 2:30 that afternoon to confirm our dinner plans, his colleague Jennifer told me that Trevor had called in sick that morning and wasn't expected to return until Friday. That evening, Trevor came home at his usual time, enthusiastic about how well his board presentation had been received and optimistic about potential promotion opportunities that might result from the positive feedback he had received. He described the presentation in detailed terms, mentioning specific questions from board members and discussing follow-up research he had been asked to prepare for the next quarterly meeting. I listened carefully to every detail of Trevor's fictional board presentation, maintaining the supportive demeanor of an interested wife while internally cataloging each lie he was telling with such conviction and specificity. This wasn't a casual deception or a minor exaggeration of workplace events. This was an elaborate fabrication delivered with the confidence of someone who had no concerns about being caught or questioned. The next day, I called Regional Trust Bank's main number and asked to speak with someone in the Executive Administration Office about board meeting schedules. Using my most professional tone and claiming to be coordinating a catering proposal for future corporate events, I learned that the bank's board of directors met quarterly, with their most recent meeting having occurred 6 weeks earlier and their next meeting scheduled for late August, more than 2 months away. Trevor had spent an entire evening describing in vivid detail a board presentation that had never happened, delivered to an audience that hadn't convened, regarding proposals that didn't exist. The sophistication and specificity of his lies were genuinely impressive from a professional standpoint, but terrifying from a personal perspective. This was the kind of deception that required advanced planning, careful preparation, and absolute confidence that the target of the deception would never verify the information independently. Determined to understand where Trevor was actually spending his time during these unexplained absences, I decided to implement physical surveillance using techniques I had learned during counterintelligence training. The following Monday morning, I waited until Trevor left for his supposed early client meeting, then followed him at a discreet distance using my personal vehicle rather than the company truck he would easily recognize. Instead of driving toward downtown Charlotte and Regional Trust Bank, Trevor headed north on Interstate 77 toward the Lake Norman area, about 30 minutes from our home. He exited at Cornelius and drove to a upscale shopping and dining complex called Birkdale Village, where he parked outside a coffee shop called Amelie's French Bakery. Through binoculars I kept in my vehicle for construction site inspections, I watched Trevor enter the coffee shop and approach a table where a woman was already seated, waiting for him. Even from a distance, I could see that this woman was young, probably in her late 20s, with long blonde hair and professional attire that suggested she worked in business or finance. More importantly, her body language and interaction with Trevor indicated this was definitely not a casual business meeting. She stood up when he approached. They embraced in a way that was clearly romantic rather than professional, and she touched his face affectionately before they sat down together. I remained in my vehicle for nearly 2 hours, watching Trevor and this unknown woman engage in what was obviously an intimate conversation. They sat close together, held hands across the table, and displayed all the physical indicators of people who were emotionally and romantically involved. When they finally left the coffee shop, they walked together toward the parking area where Trevor kissed her goodbye before they separated to their respective vehicles. Following the woman proved unnecessary because she led me directly to an office building that housed several financial services companies. The directory in the lobby listed her destination as Riverside Financial Consulting, located on the 3rd floor. Suddenly, Arthur Riverside's early morning phone calls and mysterious business relationship with my husband began to make perfect sense. Trevor wasn't involved with a male investor named Arthur Riverside. He was having an affair with a woman who worked for Riverside Financial Consulting. That evening, Trevor returned home at his usual time with another elaborate story about his successful client meeting and the promising business opportunities that were developing as a result of his presentation. He was relaxed, affectionate, and completely convincing in his role as the dedicated husband who was working hard to build a secure future for our family. If I hadn't spent the day watching him embrace another woman and kiss her goodbye, I would have had no reason to question his sincerity or suspect that anything in our marriage was amiss. But now I knew that Trevor was capable of maintaining 2 completely separate emotional relationships simultaneously, lying effortlessly about his activities, and displaying genuine affection for me while actively betraying our marriage vows. The man who made me feel safe and loved was living a double life with skills that would have impressed intelligence officers I had worked with during my military service. More troubling than the discovery of Trevor's affair was the realization that his deception extended far beyond romantic infidelity. The woman from Riverside Financial Consulting represented a professional relationship that connected directly to the mysterious phone calls, the unexplained financial discrepancies, and the increasingly sophisticated lies Trevor had been telling about his work activities. This wasn't just about emotional betrayal. This was about something much more dangerous to my business and my future. Over the next 2 weeks, I expanded my surveillance to include Trevor's electronic communications, using digital forensics techniques I had learned during military intelligence training. When Trevor left his laptop open and unattended while taking phone calls or working in other parts of the house, I would quickly access his email accounts and browser history, taking photos of relevant information with my phone before he returned. What I discovered was a complex web of financial communications that had nothing to do with his job at Regional Trust Bank, and everything to do with Mitchell & Associates construction. Trevor had been corresponding regularly with multiple individuals at Riverside Financial Consulting about detailed analyses of our business operations, our federal contract performance, our employee management systems, and our growth potential for expansion into new markets. The emails revealed that Trevor had provided Riverside Financial with comprehensive information about our banking relationships, our bonding capacity with surety companies, our relationships with federal procurement officers, and our internal accounting systems. He had shared copies of our tax returns, our contract performance evaluations, and our employee records, including salary information and benefits costs. Most disturbing were email threads discussing what Riverside Financial referred to as transition, strategies, and ownership restructuring opportunities. These conversations included detailed analyses of federal regulations governing small business classifications, veteran-owned business certifications, and the legal requirements for transferring government contracts between related business entities. 1. Particularly revealing email chain discussed the possibility of establishing a new corporation that would be eligible for government contracts currently held by Mitchell & Associates, while gradually transferring our existing relationships and operational capabilities to the new entity. The plan appeared to involve creating a legitimate business structure that could assume our federal contracts while leaving me personally liable for any financial obligations or legal complications that might arise during the transition process. Trevor's correspondence with these financial consultants was sophisticated, detailed, and clearly indicated that he had been planning some form of corporate takeover or asset transfer for several months. The level of information he had shared about our business operations was comprehensive enough to allow outsiders to completely understand and potentially replicate everything we had built over the past 5 years. But the most chilling discovery came in an email dated just 3 days earlier, where Trevor discussed accelerating the timeline and implementing contingency protocols due to increased scrutiny from the target. The language was clinical and strategic, referring to me and my business as targets of an operation rather than as the family and livelihood of someone he claimed to love. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when I accessed Trevor's personal banking information through account details he had saved in his browser's password manager. What I found was a network of financial accounts I had never known existed, including checking and savings accounts at 3 different banks, investment accounts with 2 brokerage firms, and a business account for something called Walsh Strategic Consulting. The balances in these accounts were substantial, totaling more than $180,000 in liquid assets that Trevor had accumulated without my knowledge. The transaction histories showed regular deposits that corresponded exactly with the time periods, when our business bank statements had shown unexplained discrepancies. Money was being systematically transferred from Mitchell & Associates accounts to Trevor's personal accounts through a series of intermediate transactions designed to obscure the paper trail. Trevor wasn't just planning to steal my business. He had already been stealing from it for months, using his access to our financial systems to gradually transfer funds to accounts I couldn't monitor or control. The employee bonuses he had authorized without my knowledge hadn't come from project savings. They had come from money he was stealing, allowing him to appear generous and supportive while actually looting our operating capital. The complexity and sophistication of Trevor's scheme was staggering. He had identified every vulnerability in our business structure, exploited my trust and gratitude for his assistance, and systematically gathered the information and resources necessary to destroy everything I had built while enriching himself and his conspirators at Riverside Financial Consulting. But Trevor had made one critical error in his assessment of the situation. He had assumed that his military wife would be too trusting, too grateful for his help, and too focused on day-to-day operations to notice the gradual erosion of her business until it was too late to respond effectively. He had underestimated the intelligence-gathering capabilities, strategic thinking, and operational security awareness that had kept me alive during 3 combat deployments. The same skills that had allowed me to identify and neutralize threats in Afghanistan were now giving me everything I needed to understand the full scope of Trevor's betrayal and begin planning my own strategic response. Trevor thought he was conducting a sophisticated financial operation against an unsuspecting target. What he didn't realize was that his target had been conducting counter-surveillance against him, gathering evidence of his crimes, and preparing to turn his perfect plan into his perfect downfall. The war Trevor had started was about to become a war he couldn't win. Discovering the full scope of Trevor's deception fundamentally changed my approach from passive surveillance to active intelligence gathering. The woman who had been trying to preserve her marriage was now a combat veteran, preparing to defend everything she had built from a sophisticated enemy who happened to sleep in her bed every night. I needed to understand exactly how deep this conspiracy went, who else was involved, and most importantly, what Trevor's endgame actually entailed for both me and Mitchell & Associates. My first priority was establishing secure communications and operational security protocols that would allow me to investigate Trevor's activities without alerting him to my awareness of his scheme. Using techniques I had learned during counterintelligence operations in Afghanistan, I acquired a prepaid cell phone and established encrypted email accounts that Trevor couldn't monitor or access. I also identified several locations where I could conduct research and make sensitive phone calls without any possibility of electronic surveillance or physical observation. The public library in downtown Charlotte became my primary intelligence headquarters, specifically a computer terminal, in a corner alcove where I could work with my back to the wall and clear sight lines to all approaches. During my lunch breaks from construction site inspections, I would drive to the library and spend 30 to 45 minutes analyzing the evidence I had gathered, researching the individuals and companies involved in Trevor's conspiracy, and developing strategies for gathering additional information. My military training had taught me that successful intelligence operations require understanding not just what your adversaries are doing, but why they are doing it, and what resources they have available to achieve their objectives. Trevor's scheme was clearly sophisticated and well-funded, suggesting that this wasn't an opportunistic crime, but rather a carefully planned operation with significant backing and professional expertise. Riverside Financial Consulting proved to be the key to understanding the broader scope of what I was dealing with. Using public business records databases, I discovered that the company had been incorporated in Delaware just 18 months earlier, with 3 principals listed on their registration documents: Amanda Riverside, Marcus Brennan, and David Walsh. The name David Walsh immediately caught my attention because of its similarity to Trevor's surname, suggesting either a family relationship or a deliberate attempt to create confusion about identities. Further research revealed that David Walsh was indeed Trevor's older brother, a detail that Trevor had never mentioned during our 3 years of marriage. According to his professional biography on Riverside Financial's website, David Walsh was a former investment banker with experience in corporate restructuring and small business acquisitions. His specialty was helping investors identify and acquire undervalued companies with strong growth potential and federal contracting capabilities. Amanda Riverside, the company's managing director, had an even more troubling background. Her professional experience included positions with several investment firms that specialized in what their marketing materials euphemistically called distressed asset acquisition and strategic ownership transitions. In plain language, Amanda. Riverside was an expert in taking over companies whose owners were experiencing financial difficulties, legal problems, or other circumstances that made them vulnerable to hostile acquisitions. The third principal, Marcus Brennan, brought credentials that made the scope of their operation even more alarming. Brennan was a licensed attorney with expertise in federal procurement law, small business regulations, and veteran-owned business certifications. His role in the conspiracy was clearly to provide legal strategies for transferring government contracts and business certifications from companies like mine to entities controlled by Riverside Financial. Together, these three individuals represented a sophisticated criminal enterprise with the legal, financial, and operational expertise necessary to systematically target veteran-owned businesses, infiltrate their operations through romantic or professional relationships, and execute complex schemes to transfer assets and contracts to entities they controlled. I wasn't dealing with an opportunistic husband who had decided to steal from his wife's business. I was confronting a professional criminal organization that had identified me as their next target. The implications were staggering. If Riverside Financial had successfully executed similar operations against other veteran-owned businesses, there could be dozens of families and companies that had been destroyed by their schemes. Military veterans who had risked their lives serving their country were being systematically victimized by criminals who exploited their trust, their financial vulnerabilities, and their commitment to supporting fellow veterans. This realization transformed my investigation from a personal matter into what I recognized as a patriotic duty. The same sense of mission that had motivated me during my military service now compelled me to not only protect my own business, but also to gather the evidence necessary to expose and destroy this criminal enterprise before they could victimize additional veteran families. My next objective was understanding exactly how Trevor had infiltrated my life, and whether our entire relationship had been part of a deliberate targeting strategy. Using social media research and public records databases, I began reconstructing the timeline of Trevor's involvement with Riverside Financial and his approach to establishing a relationship with me. What I discovered was both professionally impressive and personally devastating. Trevor's initial contact with me at the Veterans Day ceremony 5 years earlier hadn't been a chance encounter, but rather the result of extensive research and careful planning. Public records showed that Riverside Financial's predecessor company had been tracking federal contracting awards to veteran-owned businesses throughout the Southeast, identifying targets with substantial contract volumes and growth potential. Mitchell & Associates had appeared on their radar because of our rapid growth and our success in securing multiple Department of Veterans Affairs contracts during our first 3 years of operation. My personal background as a decorated combat veteran with leadership experience and strong relationships within the veteran community made me an ideal target for their infiltration strategy. Trevor's employment at Regional Trust Bank, which I had always assumed was his primary career, turned out to be a part-time consulting arrangement that provided him with legitimate business credentials and flexible scheduling for other activities. His real occupation was working as an infiltration specialist for companies like Riverside Financial, using his charm, financial expertise, and knowledge of banking systems to gain access to target businesses and their operations. The sophistication of Trevor's approach was remarkable from a professional standpoint. He had spent months researching my background, my business operations, my personal interests, and my emotional vulnerabilities before engineering our accidental meeting at the Veterans Day ceremony. He knew about my military service, my challenges, transitioning to civilian life, my commitment to helping fellow veterans, and my desire for a stable personal relationship after years of military deployments. Everything about Trevor's courtship had been carefully designed to appeal to my specific needs and circumstances. His interest in my military experience wasn't genuine admiration, but rather intelligence gathering to understand my decision-making processes and leadership style. His enthusiasm for supporting veteran-owned businesses wasn't patriotic sentiment, but rather preparation for understanding and eventually exploiting the operational vulnerabilities of companies like mine. Even our wedding venue at Fort Bragg had been Trevor's suggestion, presented as his desire to honor my military service, but actually designed to reinforce his image as a supportive partner who respected my background and values. The entire relationship had been a performance, executed with such skill and consistency that I had never questioned his sincerity or suspected his ulterior motives. The most disturbing aspect of this discovery was realizing how completely Trevor had studied and manipulated my emotional responses throughout our relationship. He knew exactly which behaviors would make me feel loved and supported, which gestures would reinforce my trust in his commitment, and which conversations would make me more likely to rely on his guidance and expertise. My military training had prepared me to recognize and resist interrogation techniques, psychological manipulation, and coercive persuasion in hostile environments. But I had never considered that those same techniques could be employed by someone who shared my bed, claimed to love me, and presented himself as my partner in building a life together. Trevor's manipulation had been so subtle and consistent that I had actually thanked him for behaviors that were designed to facilitate his access to my business operations and financial systems. His willingness to help with bookkeeping wasn't generosity, it was reconnaissance. His interest in our federal contracts wasn't supportive partnership, it was intelligence gathering. His suggestions for improving our financial management weren't professional advice, they were preparation for systematic theft. But understanding Trevor's methods also revealed the vulnerabilities in his approach that I could exploit to turn his scheme against him. Trevor's success depended on maintaining his cover identity and preserving my trust in his motivations. If I could continue appearing to be the naive, trusting wife he believed me to be while actually gathering evidence of his crimes, I could potentially document enough information to destroy not only Trevor, but the entire Riverside financial operation. My military experience with deception operations and double agents had taught me that the most effective way to defeat sophisticated enemies was often to let them believe their plans were succeeding while actually controlling the information they received and the opportunities they were given to act on that information. Trevor thought he was manipulating me, but I was about to start manipulating him. The challenge was maintaining operational security while gathering the additional evidence I needed to ensure that Trevor and his co-conspirators would face federal criminal charges rather than simply being exposed and allowed to relocate their operations to target other victims. I needed documented proof of their conspiracy, evidence of the money they had already stolen, and preferably recordings of them discussing their methods and future plans. More importantly, I needed to protect Mitchell and Associates from any additional financial damage while ensuring that our federal contracts and business relationships wouldn't be compromised by Trevor's scheme. My employees depended on our company for their livelihoods, and many of them were fellow veterans who had struggled to find stable employment after their military service. I couldn't allow Trevor's greed to destroy the opportunities we had created. For people who had already sacrificed so much serving their country, the scope of what I needed to accomplish was daunting. But my military training had prepared me for complex operations under dangerous circumstances. The same planning and execution capabilities that had allowed me to manage supply chains in combat zones would now be applied to documenting criminal activity and protecting innocent people from sophisticated predators. Trevor had chosen the wrong target for his elaborate scheme. Instead of finding a vulnerable victim who could be easily manipulated and discarded, he had identified a combat veteran with intelligence training, strategic thinking capabilities, and an unshakable commitment to protecting the people and principles she cared about most. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Trevor was going to discover that his perfect plan had one fatal flaw. His target was more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The revelation that I was dealing with a professional criminal organization rather than just an unfaithful husband fundamentally changed my strategic approach. This wasn't about saving my marriage or confronting personal betrayal. This was about neutralizing a sophisticated threat that posed immediate danger to my business, my employees, and potentially dozens of other veteran families who might become future targets. I needed to gather enough evidence to ensure federal prosecution while protecting myself from whatever final phase Trevor and his accomplices were planning. My first priority was understanding the immediate timeline of their operation. Based on Trevor's recent communications with Riverside Financial about accelerating the timeline and implementing contingency protocols, I suspected they were preparing to execute the final phase of their scheme within weeks rather than months. This urgency suggested either that they had gathered enough assets to make their exit profitable, or that they had detected some indication of my awareness and were moving to secure their gains before I could respond effectively. To determine which scenario was more likely, I needed to establish exactly how much money Trevor had already stolen and whether there were additional thefts planned or in progress. Using the account information I had discovered in his browser's password manager, I began systematically documenting every unauthorized transfer from Mitchell & Associates accounts to Trevor's personal banking network. The scope of his theft was even more extensive than I had initially realized. Over the past 8 months, Trevor had systematically transferred a total of $247,000 from our business accounts through a complex series of intermediate transactions designed to obscure the paper trail. The transfers had been carefully structured to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems, with individual amounts staying below the thresholds that would require additional verification or documentation. Trevor's method was sophisticated and demonstrated professional knowledge of banking security protocols. Rather than making large, obvious transfers that would immediately raise suspicions, he had created a network of shell accounts and legitimate-appearing business transactions that gradually moved money from our operating funds to accounts he controlled. Each transfer was documented with fabricated invoices for consulting services, equipment purchases, or subcontractor payments that appeared legitimate unless someone investigated the recipients carefully. The fake invoices were particularly impressive. From a technical standpoint, Trevor had created detailed documentation for services supposedly provided by companies that didn't exist, complete with professional letterhead, itemized billing statements, and terms that matched standard industry practices. Someone reviewing our financial records would see what appeared to be normal business expenses for consulting, equipment maintenance, and specialty subcontracting services. More troubling was my discovery that Trevor's theft operation was accelerating rather than winding down. Transaction records showed increasingly large transfers during the past 3 weeks, including a $35,000 payment to Strategic Planning Associates just 5 days earlier. If Trevor was preparing to execute some final phase of his scheme, he was simultaneously maximizing the amount of money he could steal before his deception was exposed. This pattern suggested that Trevor wasn't planning to simply disappear with whatever money he had already stolen. The continued escalation of his theft activities indicated that he was building towards some climactic event that would allow him to secure significantly larger gains than what he could achieve through gradual embezzlement. Given Riverside Financial's expertise in corporate acquisitions and their communications about ownership restructuring opportunities, I suspected they were planning to somehow seize control of Mitchell & Associates entirely. To understand their specific strategy, I needed to intercept additional communications between Trevor and his co-conspirators. This required implementing electronic surveillance techniques that would allow me to monitor his phone calls and email communications without alerting him to my activities. Using skills I had learned during signal intelligence operations in Afghanistan, I installed discrete monitoring software on our home wireless network that would capture and forward copies of Trevor's electronic communications to secure accounts I had established. The intelligence I gathered over the next week revealed the full scope of their planned operation, and it was far more dangerous than I had imagined. Trevor and his accomplices weren't just planning to steal money from my business, they were preparing to frame me for federal crimes that would result in my imprisonment while they assumed control of Mitchell & Associates and its lucrative government contracts. Their strategy was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. Trevor had been systematically creating false evidence that I was embezzling money from federal contracts, accepting kickbacks from subcontractors, and falsifying documentation submitted to government procurement officers. The same techniques he had used to steal money from our accounts would be presented as evidence of my criminal activity, with Trevor positioned as the innocent spouse who had discovered his wife's illegal behavior and cooperated with federal investigators to expose the fraud. Email communications between Trevor and Amanda Riverside revealed that they had already contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, claiming to have evidence of fraud involving federal contracting funds. Trevor was scheduled to meet with federal agents the following Tuesday to present documentation of what he claimed was my systematic theft of government money intended for veterans services and infrastructure projects. The evidence Trevor planned to present was a masterwork of criminal deception. Using his access to our financial systems and his knowledge of federal contracting requirements, he had created a comprehensive case file that portrayed me as a corrupt contractor who had been stealing from multiple government agencies while using my military service and veteran advocacy as cover for criminal activity. The fabricated evidence included forged bank statements showing money being transferred to accounts I had never opened, fake invoices for services that had never been provided, and altered contract documentation that made legitimate business transactions appear to be fraudulent schemes. Trevor had even created false email communications that appeared to show me coordinating with fictitious subcontractors to inflate contract costs and split the resulting overpayments. Most insidiously, Trevor had prepared explanations for every aspect of his own criminal activity that would instead implicate me as the mastermind behind the fraud. The money he had stolen would be presented as evidence of my embezzlement. The shell companies he had created would be portrayed as my vehicles for money laundering. The communications with Riverside Financial would be characterized as my attempts to hide stolen assets through offshore investment schemes. The psychological sophistication of Trevor's frame job was breathtaking. He had positioned himself as the concerned husband who had gradually discovered his wife's criminal behavior and reluctantly decided to cooperate with federal authorities despite the personal cost of exposing someone he loved. His willingness to provide evidence against me would be presented as patriotic duty overcoming personal loyalty, making him appear heroic rather than criminal. If Trevor's plan succeeded, I would face federal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy, with potential sentences that could result in decades in prison. Meanwhile, Trevor would emerge as a victim who had been unknowingly married to a criminal, with legal standing to assume control of Mitchell and Associates and its assets during my incarceration. Riverside Financial would then help him restructure the company, transfer its federal contracts, and eventually sell or liquidate the business for their mutual profit. The timeline for Trevor's operation was frighteningly close. His meeting with federal agents was scheduled for the following Tuesday, just 6 days away. Once he presented his fabricated evidence to the FBI, their investigation would move quickly, and I would likely be arrested within days or weeks. Federal prosecutors would have no reason to question Trevor's documentation, especially given his apparent cooperation and willingness to implicate his own wife in criminal activity. But Trevor's sophisticated plan had one critical vulnerability that he hadn't anticipated. His target was a combat veteran with intelligence training who had been conducting her own investigation for weeks. While Trevor was preparing to frame me for crimes he had committed, I had been gathering evidence of his actual criminal activity and documenting every aspect of his conspiracy with Riverside Financial. More importantly, I now understood exactly when and how Trevor planned to execute his frame job, giving me 6 days to implement a counter-strategy that would turn his own evidence against him while exposing the entire Riverside Financial operation to federal prosecution. The irony was perfect. Trevor had spent months creating false evidence to frame me for federal crimes, but his communications with his co-conspirators had provided me with genuine evidence of their actual federal crimes. His plan to have me arrested for fraud would instead result in his own arrest for conspiracy, money laundering, and a dozen other charges that would send him to federal prison for decades. But I needed to be extraordinarily careful about how I proceeded. If Trevor suspected that I was aware of his plan, he might accelerate his timeline or modify his strategy in ways that could still result in serious damage to my business and reputation. I needed to let him believe that his scheme was proceeding exactly as planned while actually controlling the information he provided to federal agents and ensuring that his evidence would be immediately recognized as fraudulent. My military training had prepared me for exactly this type of deception operation. In Afghanistan, we had regularly conducted false flag operations designed to mislead enemy forces about our intentions and capabilities while gathering intelligence about their plans and resources. The same principles that had allowed us to neutralize insurgent networks would now be applied to destroying Trevor's criminal conspiracy. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but Trevor was about to discover that his prey was actually a predator who had been stalking him while he believed he was stalking her. His perfect frame job was about to become the evidence that would frame him instead, and his meeting with federal agents would mark the beginning of his own destruction rather than mine. The final phase of our deadly game was about to begin, and only one of us would still be free when it ended. With only 6 days remaining before Trevor's scheduled meeting with federal agents, I faced the most critical phase of what had become a complex intelligence operation. Everything I had discovered about Trevor's criminal conspiracy would be meaningless unless I could ensure that federal investigators would immediately recognize his evidence as fabricated while simultaneously presenting them with genuine proof of his crimes and those of his co-conspirators at Riverside Financial. My strategy required executing multiple simultaneous operations with military precision. I needed to document additional evidence of Trevor's theft and fraud, establish contact with federal law enforcement through channels that would ensure my credibility, protect Mitchell and Associates from any immediate financial damage, and maintain my cover as the unsuspecting wife until the moment Trevor walked into his FBI meeting expecting to destroy my life. The first component of my counter-operation involved securing the assistance of someone within federal law enforcement who could properly evaluate the evidence I had gathered and coordinate an appropriate response to Trevor's planned frame job. My military service had connected me with numerous individuals who had transitioned to careers in federal agencies, but I needed someone with specific expertise in financial crimes and sufficient authority to act quickly on the intelligence I could provide. Captain Maria Rodriguez, now Special Agent Rodriguez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, had served as a military intelligence officer during overlapping deployments in Afghanistan. We had worked together on several operations involving the interdiction of insurgent financing networks, and I trusted both her professional competence and her personal integrity. More importantly, she understood the capabilities and credibility that came with my military background and intelligence training. Using secure communication protocols I had established through my prepaid phone and encrypted email accounts, I contacted Agent Rodriguez and requested an urgent meeting regarding what I described as an active conspiracy involving federal contracting fraud and the targeting of veteran-owned businesses. I provided just enough information to indicate the seriousness of the situation without revealing details that could compromise operational security if our communications were somehow intercepted. Agent Rodriguez agreed to meet with me that evening at a location of her choosing, a coffee shop near the federal building in downtown Charlotte, that would allow us to speak privately while maintaining the appearance of a casual social meeting. When I arrived, I carried a comprehensive briefing package that included copies of all the evidence I had gathered, organized according to military intelligence standards for documenting criminal networks and their operations. The meeting with Agent Rodriguez lasted nearly 3 hours as I systematically presented the evidence of Trevor's criminal conspiracy, his planned frame job, and the broader operations of Riverside Financial. Agent Rodriguez was initially skeptical of what appeared to be an extraordinary story involving sophisticated financial crimes and an elaborate deception operation. But her skepticism transformed into professional concern as she reviewed the documentation I had prepared. "Sarah, this is federal conspiracy on a scale that requires immediate intervention," Agent Rodriguez said after reviewing the intercepted communications between Trevor and his co-conspirators. "If what you've documented here is accurate, we're looking at a criminal enterprise that has been systematically targeting veteran-owned businesses throughout multiple states. This goes far beyond your personal situation." Agent Rodriguez explained that Trevor's planned meeting with federal agents the following Tuesday would actually work to our advantage. providing an opportunity to document his attempt to present fabricated evidence while simultaneously arresting him and his co-conspirators for their actual crimes. However, coordinating such an operation would require careful preparation and absolute secrecy to ensure that Trevor didn't suspect the trap we were setting for him. The FBI's strategy would involve allowing Trevor to proceed with his planned meeting while secretly recording his presentation of fabricated evidence and coordinating simultaneous arrests of Amanda Riverside, Marcus Brennan, and David Walsh at Riverside Financial's offices. Federal agents would also execute search warrants for all of Trevor's personal and business accounts, preserving evidence of the money laundering operation before the conspirators could destroy documentation or transfer additional assets. My role in the operation would be to continue maintaining my cover as the unsuspecting wife, while secretly wearing recording equipment during conversations with Trevor that might provide additional evidence of his criminal intent. Agent Rodriguez emphasized that this was potentially dangerous, as criminals facing exposure often became unpredictable and violent. But my military training and combat experience made me uniquely qualified to handle such risks. The second component of my counter-operation involved protecting Mitchell and Associates from any additional financial damage, while ensuring that our federal contracts and business relationships would remain secure regardless of whatever accusations Trevor might make. During his FBI meeting, this required implementing immediate changes to our financial systems and banking arrangements without alerting Trevor to my awareness of his theft operations. Working with our primary bank, I established new account access protocols that would require dual authorization for any transfers above minimal amounts, effectively preventing Trevor from stealing additional money while maintaining the appearance that he still had the financial access he expected. I also initiated a comprehensive audit of our financial records by an independent accounting firm, positioning this as routine business planning rather than fraud investigation. More importantly, I contacted key personnel at the Department of Veterans Affairs and other federal agencies where we held contracts, providing them with advance notice that Mitchell and Associates might be subject to false allegations involving financial impropriety. Without revealing the specific details of Trevor's planned frame job, I explained that a disgruntled former business associate was threatening to make unfounded accusations about our contract performance and financial management. These preemptive communications served multiple purposes. They established my proactive approach to addressing potential problems, demonstrated my commitment to transparency with federal procurement officials, and created a paper trail showing that I had anticipated and reported the possibility of false allegations before Trevor made his accusations to the FBI. The third component of my strategy involved gathering additional evidence that would make Trevor's guilt absolutely undeniable, while simultaneously documenting his attempt to frame me for crimes he had committed. This required maintaining extremely careful operational security while encouraging Trevor to reveal more details about his plan and his co-conspirators' involvement. Using techniques I had learned during interrogation operations in Afghanistan, I began subtly steering our conversations toward topics that would encourage Trevor to discuss his work activities and business relationships. By expressing interest in his professional success and asking supportive questions about his career development, I was able to elicit additional information about his connections with Riverside Financial and his role in their operations. Trevor's confidence in his plan made him remarkably talkative about his activities, though he continued to present everything in terms of legitimate business development rather than criminal conspiracy. During these conversations, I was secretly recording everything using equipment provided by Agent Rodriguez, capturing Trevor's admissions about his access to our financial systems, his relationships with Riverside Financial personnel, and his detailed knowledge of our federal contracts and business operations. The most valuable intelligence came during a conversation where Trevor discussed his plans for our future financial security after some business restructuring that he claimed would soon make us much wealthier. While Trevor presented this in terms of legitimate investment opportunities, his comments revealed specific details about how Riverside Financial planned to acquire and liquidate our assets following My anticipated arrest and incarceration. Trevor's casual discussion of our post-restructuring lifestyle included details about relocating to a state with no extradition treaties, establishing new identities through documentation services he had already contacted, and accessing offshore accounts where our money would be safely invested beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. These admissions provided crucial evidence of Trevor's intent to flee the country with stolen assets while leaving me to face criminal charges for his crimes. But the most damning evidence came when Trevor made a phone call to Amanda Riverside while I was within listening range, believing I was occupied with household tasks in another part of the house. During this conversation, Trevor confirmed that his FBI meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday and discussed final preparations for presenting what he referred to as the complete case file against me. The conversation revealed that Riverside Financial had prepared extensive backup documentation to support Trevor's accusations, including forged federal procurement records, fabricated correspondence with government officials, and detailed financial analyses designed to prove systematic fraud in our contract performance. They had also identified a fallback plan involving accusations of terrorist financing and money laundering if their initial fraud allegations failed to result in immediate arrest and asset forfeiture. Most chillingly, Trevor and Amanda Riverside discussed contingency plans for dealing with me if their frame job somehow failed to achieve their objectives. Their backup strategy involved creating evidence of my involvement in illegal arms trafficking or other national security crimes that would result in indefinite detention without the legal protections available to defendants in standard federal criminal cases. The sophistication and thoroughness of their criminal enterprise was genuinely impressive from a professional standpoint, but their willingness to destroy multiple lives for financial gain was absolutely terrifying from a human perspective. These weren't opportunistic criminals who had stumbled into a profitable scheme. They were professional predators who had systematically developed methods for targeting and victimizing military veterans and their families. By the weekend before Trevor's scheduled FBI meeting, I had gathered enough evidence to ensure that his conspiracy would be completely exposed and that all of the participants would face serious federal charges. More importantly, Agent Rodriguez had confirmed that the FBI's investigation had expanded to include similar operations in other states, suggesting that our evidence would help prosecute a criminal network that had victimized dozens of families throughout the Southeast. Trevor spent that weekend in an exceptionally good mood, clearly anticipating his Tuesday meeting as the culmination of months of careful planning and preparation. He was affectionate, attentive, and optimistic about our future together, apparently believing that his frame job would soon result in both my imprisonment and his acquisition of substantial wealth through the liquidation of everything I had built. Watching Trevor's satisfaction with his anticipated success was surreal and nauseating, but it also provided final confirmation that he had no awareness of the trap we had set for him. His confidence in his plan and his casual discussion of our post-conspiracy lifestyle demonstrated that he genuinely believed his scheme was foolproof and that I was too naive and trusting to have discovered his deception. Trevor's fatal miscalculation was about to cost him everything he had hoped to gain, while the woman he had targeted for destruction was about to emerge victorious in a conflict he had never realized he was fighting. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that would have made any other day beautiful, but today felt like the calm before a storm that would fundamentally change multiple lives forever. Trevor woke up at his usual time, went through his normal morning routine, and prepared for what he believed would be his triumphant meeting with federal agents, where he would present his carefully fabricated evidence and watch his elaborate plan finally come to fruition. I maintained my role as the supportive wife, preparing his favorite breakfast, and wishing him luck with what he had told me was an important business presentation for potential new clients. Trevor was unusually animated during breakfast, discussing plans for celebrating that evening and suggesting we make reservations at the expensive steakhouse downtown, where we had celebrated our wedding anniversary. His anticipation was palpable, and his confidence in the success of his scheme was absolute. "Today is going to change everything for us, sweetheart," Trevor said as he gathered his briefcase and the portfolio containing what he believed was devastating evidence of my criminal activity. "After this meeting, we're going to have opportunities we never imagined possible. Our whole future is going to be different." I kissed him goodbye at the door, maintaining the loving demeanor of a wife who had no idea her husband was about to attempt destroying her life, while internally counting down the hours until Trevor would discover that his perfect plan had become his perfect nightmare. Agent Rodriguez had confirmed that everything was in place for what she described as one of the most comprehensive white-collar crime stings the FBI had executed in the Southeast region. The federal building in downtown Charlotte was bustling, with its usual Tuesday morning activity when Trevor arrived for his scheduled meeting with Special Agent Kenneth Morrison and Special Agent Lisa Chen from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. These agents had been carefully briefed about Trevor's planned presentation and were prepared to allow him to completely incriminate himself while secretly recording every detail of his attempted frame job. Trevor was escorted to Conference Room B on the 14th floor, a sterile government space equipped with hidden recording equipment and observation capabilities that would document his criminal presentation from multiple angles. Agent Morrison and Agent Chen introduced themselves as investigators specializing in federal contracting fraud and expressed appreciation for Trevor's willingness to come forward with information about potential criminal activity. "Mr. Walsh, we understand you have information regarding possible fraud involving federal contracts and a veteran-owned construction company," Agent Morrison began, settling into his chair across from Trevor with a demeanor that suggested professional interest and gratitude for civic cooperation. "We take these allegations very seriously, especially when they involve the misuse of funds intended for veteran services." Trevor's presentation was masterful in its sophistication and devastating in its completeness. For nearly 2 hours, he systematically presented his fabricated evidence, explaining how he had gradually discovered what appeared to be systematic embezzlement and fraud being committed by his wife through Mitchell and Associates Construction. His documentation was comprehensive, professional, and convincing enough that uninformed observers might have actually believed his accusations. The fake bank statements Trevor presented showed apparent money transfers from federal contract accounts to personal accounts that he claimed belonged to me. The forged invoices indicated payments for services that were never provided and equipment that was never delivered. The altered email communications suggested coordination with fictitious subcontractors to inflate contract costs and split the resulting overpayments. Trevor's emotional performance during the presentation was particularly impressive, displaying what appeared to be genuine anguish at having to expose criminal behavior by someone he loved. He spoke about the difficulty of reconciling his admiration for my military service with his growing suspicion that I was stealing money intended for veteran programs and infrastructure projects. Sarah's military background made it hard for me to believe she could be involved in anything dishonest, Trevor explained to the agents, his voice carrying convincing notes of disappointment and betrayal. But the evidence kept accumulating, and I finally realized I had a patriotic duty to report what I had discovered, regardless of the personal cost. Agent Morrison and Agent Chen maintained their professional demeanor throughout Trevor's presentation, asking detailed questions about the evidence and requesting clarification about specific transactions and dates. Their questions were designed to encourage Trevor to provide even more incriminating details about his own criminal activity while believing he was strengthening his case against me. "This is very serious information, Mr. Walsh," Agent Chen said after reviewing Trevor's documentation. "Federal contracting fraud carries severe penalties, especially when it involves veteran services and Department of Veterans Affairs funding. We'll need to verify this evidence and coordinate with other agencies that may have been affected." Trevor's satisfaction with the agent's response was obvious. He had successfully presented his case, convinced federal investigators of my guilt, and positioned himself as the heroic whistleblower who had overcome personal loyalty to serve the public interest. From his perspective, The meeting had exceeded his expectations and virtually guaranteed that his plan would succeed. But while Trevor was congratulating himself on his brilliant performance, events were unfolding simultaneously in other locations that would soon transform his moment of triumph into the beginning of his destruction. At exactly the same time Trevor was presenting his fabricated evidence, federal agents were executing coordinated search warrants at Riverside Financial's offices, Amanda Riverside's residence, Marcus Brennan's law office, and David Walsh's apartment. Searches yielded overwhelming evidence of the conspiracy Trevor had been trying to conceal. Agents recovered detailed planning documents outlining the targeting and infiltration strategies used against multiple veteran-owned businesses. They found financial records showing the movement of stolen money through networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. Most damaging of all, they discovered communications between the conspirators discussing their methods for creating fraudulent evidence and framing their victims for crimes they hadn't committed. Amanda Riverside was arrested at her office while attempting to destroy computer files containing client lists and operational procedures for what internal documents referred to as asset acquisition operations. Marcus Brennan was taken into custody at his law office after agents found detailed legal strategies for transferring government contracts from targeted companies to entities controlled by Riverside Financial. David Walsh was arrested at his apartment while packing suitcases for what appeared to be an imminent departure to a non-extradition country. Meanwhile, in Conference Room B, Trevor was completely unaware that his co-conspirators were being arrested and that years of their criminal planning were being systematically documented by federal agents. He was actually discussing timeline expectations for my arrest and expressing concern about minimizing public attention that might damage what he claimed was his legitimate business reputation. I want to be clear that my only interest is seeing justice done, Trevor told the agents with apparent sincerity. Sarah's actions have betrayed not just me personally, but every veteran who trusted her company with federal contracts. I just want to make sure she's held accountable for what she's done. Agent Morrison's response was carefully measured and completely truthful, though Trevor interpreted it in terms of his own expectations rather than the reality of what was about to happen. Mr. Walsh, I can assure you that everyone responsible for these crimes will be held fully accountable. Justice will definitely be served, and those who have violated federal law will face appropriate consequences. The trap was closing around Trevor with precision that would have impressed his co-conspirators if they hadn't been simultaneously experiencing their own arrests. At exactly 3:15 that afternoon, while Trevor was shaking hands with the federal agents and thanking them for their professionalism, Agent Rodriguez entered Conference Room B with additional FBI personnel and a very different agenda than Trevor was expecting. Mr. Trevor Walsh, Agent Rodriguez announced with the authority of someone who had been planning this moment for days. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and attempting to provide false information to federal investigators. The transformation in Trevor's demeanor was instantaneous and complete. The confident man who had spent 2 hours presenting evidence of my supposed crimes became a panicked criminal who suddenly understood that his elaborate plan had not only failed, but had actually provided federal agents with detailed documentation of his own criminal activity. There's been some mistake, Trevor stammered, his face draining of color as Agent Rodriguez began reading his rights. I'm the one who reported the fraud. I'm cooperating with your investigation. You should be arresting my wife, not me. Agent Morrison's response was devastating in its clarity and finality. Mr. Walsh, every piece of evidence you presented today is fabricated. We've been investigating your criminal conspiracy for weeks, and your presentation this afternoon has provided us with detailed documentation of your intent to frame your wife for crimes you committed. As additional agents entered the conference room to escort Trevor to a holding cell, Agent Rodriguez provided him with a brief summary of the evidence that had been gathered against him and his co-conspirators. The intercepted communications, the documented theft operations, the coordinated arrests of his partners, and most importantly, the recordings of his own admissions about the conspiracy and his plans for fleeing the country with stolen assets. Trevor's final words before being led away in handcuffs were a desperate attempt to maintain his deception even in the face of overwhelming evidence. "You don't understand what Sarah is capable of. She's manipulated all of you. She's using her military training to deceive federal agents. You're making a terrible mistake." But federal agents understood exactly what was happening, and their mistake had been believing for even a moment that Trevor's scheme might have succeeded. The woman he had targeted for destruction had instead orchestrated his capture using skills and resources he had never imagined she possessed. While Trevor was being processed into federal custody, I was meeting with Agent Rodriguez at FBI headquarters to provide additional evidence and testimony that would ensure the conspiracy charges against all 4 defendants would result in lengthy federal prison sentences. The evidence I had gathered during my counterintelligence operation, combined with the documentation recovered during the coordinated searches, provided prosecutors with one of the most comprehensive white-collar crime cases in recent federal history. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond what even I had initially understood. Federal investigators had identified 17 other veteran-owned businesses that had been targeted by Riverside Financial's operations, with at least 9 companies having been successfully infiltrated and liquidated over the past 3 years. The total amount of money stolen from veteran entrepreneurs and federal contracting programs exceeded $3.2 million. More importantly, the methods Trevor and his co-conspirators had developed for targeting military veterans represented a particularly despicable form of criminal activity that exploited the trust, loyalty, and service-oriented values that defined the veteran community. These weren't random crimes of opportunity. They were systematic attacks on people who had already sacrificed enormously in service to their country. As I left the federal building that evening, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from suspicious wife to intelligence, operative to key witness in a major federal prosecution. The same skills that had kept me alive during combat operations in Afghanistan had ultimately saved my business, protected my employees, and helped bring justice to families who had been victimized by professional predators. Trevor's perfect crime had indeed changed everything for us, just not in the way he had anticipated. His elaborate plan to frame me for federal crimes had instead resulted in his own federal prosecution, while the woman he had underestimated was about to emerge from his conspiracy stronger, wiser, and more successful than ever before. The aftermath of Trevor's arrest unfolded with the methodical precision of a military operation, bringing justice not only to my personal situation, but to the dozens of families who had been victimized by Riverside Financial's sophisticated criminal enterprise. Federal prosecutors moved quickly to ensure that Trevor and his co-conspirators would face the full consequences of their crimes while simultaneously working to recover stolen assets and restore what had been taken from veteran-owned businesses throughout the Southeast. Within 72 hours of the coordinated arrests, federal agents had seized more than $2.8 million in assets from various accounts controlled by the conspiracy, including the offshore investments where Trevor had been hiding money stolen from Mitchell & Associates and other targeted companies. The speed and thoroughness of the asset recovery operation was possible only because of the detailed financial intelligence I had gathered during my counter-surveillance activities and the comprehensive documentation recovered during the search warrants. My role in the federal prosecution became even more significant as investigators discovered that my evidence was crucial for connecting seemingly unrelated crimes across multiple states and proving the systematic nature of Riverside Financial's operations. Special Agent Rodriguez explained that without my military intelligence background and the sophisticated evidence-gathering techniques I had employed, prosecutors might never have been able to demonstrate the full scope of the conspiracy or secure convictions against all 4 defendants. The criminal charges filed against Trevor, Amanda Riverside, Marcus Brennan, and David Walsh were extensive and carried potential sentences that would effectively end their criminal careers permanently. Trevor faced 18 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, and providing false information to federal investigators. Each count carried substantial mandatory minimum sentences that would likely result in Trevor spending the next 20 to 25 years in federal prison. Amanda Riverside and Marcus Brennan faced similar charges related to their roles in organizing and executing the conspiracy, while David Walsh was charged as both a conspirator and an accessory for his involvement in the money laundering operations and his assistance in creating false documentation used to frame multiple victims. The federal prosecutor handling the case, Assistant United States Attorney Jennifer Matthews, described it as one of the most comprehensive white-collar prosecutions her office had undertaken. The legal proceedings moved forward with remarkable efficiency as the defendants quickly realized that the evidence against them was overwhelming and that lengthy prison sentences were inevitable, regardless of their plea decisions. Trevor's attorney advised him that cooperation with prosecutors might result in a reduced sentence, but Trevor's attempts to provide information about other criminal activities were largely unsuccessful because he had been primarily an operational asset rather than a strategic planner within the Riverside financial organization. Amanda Riverside proved more cooperative, providing detailed information about similar operations in other regions and helping federal investigators identify additional victims who hadn't yet realized they had been targeted by financial crimes. Her cooperation led to the recovery of substantial additional assets and the identification of a broader criminal network that had been operating sophisticated fraud schemes against veteran-owned businesses throughout the entire southeastern United States. The trial proceedings provided a fascinating glimpse into the sophistication and ruthlessness of modern financial criminals. Federal prosecutors presented evidence showing how Riverside Financial had developed detailed psychological profiles of potential targets, focusing specifically on military veterans whose sense of duty and trust made them particularly vulnerable to infiltration and manipulation. The conspiracy had employed former intelligence officers, trained psychologists, and experienced con artists to create elaborate false identities and emotional relationships designed to gain access to target businesses. Trevor's testimony during his own trial was particularly revealing about the depth of deception he had employed in our relationship. Under oath, he admitted that virtually every aspect of our courtship and marriage had been planned and executed as part of his infiltration strategy. His interest in my military service, his enthusiasm for supporting veteran-owned businesses, his financial expertise, and even his romantic gestures had all been calculated elements of a sophisticated psychological operation designed to gain my trust and access to Mitchell and Associates. The emotional impact of these revelations was significant, but my military training had prepared me to compartmentalize personal feelings and focus on the strategic objectives that mattered most: ensuring justice for all victims and protecting other military families from similar exploitation. Testifying against Trevor was professionally satisfying rather than personally difficult, because I understood that my evidence was helping to dismantle a criminal organization that posed ongoing threats to the veteran community. The sentences, handed down by federal Judge Patricia Williams, reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the judge's recognition that the defendants had specifically targeted military veterans who had already sacrificed enormously in service to their country. Trevor received 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, effectively ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his productive adult life incarcerated for his crimes. Amanda Riverside received 25 years for her role as the primary organizer of the conspiracy, while Marcus Brennan was sentenced to 18 years for his legal facilitation of the fraud operations. David Walsh, whose cooperation had been more substantial and whose role had been less central to the planning process, received 12 years in federal prison along with substantial restitution obligations. Beyond the criminal prosecutions, the Civil recovery process allowed victims of the conspiracy to reclaim most of their stolen assets, while also receiving additional compensation for the damages they had suffered. Mitchell and Associates recovered not only the $247,000 that Trevor had stolen, but also received punitive damages that totaled more than $400,000 from the liquidation of assets seized from all four defendants. More importantly, the federal investigation had exposed systematic weaknesses in the oversight of veteran-owned business programs that had made military entrepreneurs particularly vulnerable to sophisticated financial criminals. The Department of Veterans Affairs implemented new security protocols for monitoring federal contracts, while the Small Business Administration established enhanced verification procedures for companies claiming veteran-owned status in federal procurement processes. The impact of the case extended far beyond financial recovery and procedural improvements. Media coverage of the Riverside financial conspiracy helped educate the veteran community about the sophisticated tactics being employed by criminals who specifically targeted military families for financial exploitation. Veteran service organizations throughout the country began offering workshops on financial security and fraud prevention, using our case as an example of how military skills and training could be applied to recognize and counter civilian threats. My personal recovery from Trevor's betrayal was surprisingly straightforward, largely because my military experience had prepared me to distinguish between professional threats and personal injuries. The man I had loved and trusted had never actually existed. Trevor Walsh had been a fictional character created by a professional criminal to facilitate his access to my business and assets. Understanding this distinction made it easier to process the emotional aspects of his deception while focusing on the practical implications for my future security and success. Mitchell and Associates not only survived Trevor's attempted destruction, but actually emerged stronger and more successful than ever before. The federal investigation had provided independent verification of our ethical business practices and our genuine commitment to serving the veteran community. Government procurement officers who had worked with us during the investigation became some of our strongest advocates, helping us secure additional contracts and expand our operations into new markets. Our employee base grew from 23 to 38 over the 6 months following Trevor's arrest, as we were able to hire additional veterans who benefited from both our expanded contract portfolio and our enhanced reputation within the federal contracting community. The financial recovery from the criminal prosecutions allowed us to invest in new equipment, expanded facilities, and enhanced benefits for our workforce. Perhaps most significantly, Mitchell and Associates became a model for other veteran-owned businesses seeking to protect themselves from financial crimes and sophisticated fraud schemes. We developed comprehensive security protocols for financial management, employee background investigations, and partnership evaluations that were adopted by veteran business organizations throughout the region. My personal transformation during the investigation and prosecution process revealed capabilities and strengths that I hadn't fully recognized even during my military service. The intelligence gathering skills, strategic planning abilities, and psychological resilience that had enabled me to neutralize Trevor's conspiracy were assets that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of his criminal scheme. These discoveries led to new opportunities for service within the veteran community and the broader business world. Federal agencies began consulting with me about security vulnerabilities in veteran-owned business programs, while business organizations requested presentations about recognizing and countering sophisticated fraud schemes. My experience became a resource for protecting other entrepreneurs from the kind of systematic exploitation that Trevor and his co-conspirators had attempted. The most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was receiving letters and phone calls from other veterans whose businesses had been saved by the exposure of Riverside Financial's operations. Several entrepreneurs contacted me to report that they had recognized warning signs in their own situations after learning about Trevor's methods, allowing them to protect themselves from infiltration attempts or financial crimes that were already in progress. Federal Agent Rodriguez remained in contact throughout the recovery process, providing updates about related investigations and the broader impact of our case on white-collar crime prosecution. She explained that the evidence and methods we had developed were being used to train federal agents in other regions, helping law enforcement agencies recognize and investigate similar conspiracies targeting veteran-owned businesses. The Riverside financial case also contributed to enhanced coordination between military and civilian law enforcement agencies, as investigators recognized that military veterans possessed unique skills and perspectives that could be valuable for both preventing and investigating sophisticated financial crimes. This collaboration resulted in new training programs and resource-sharing initiatives that strengthened protection for the entire veteran business community. Looking back on the 8 months from my first suspicions about Trevor's mysterious phone calls to his final sentencing in federal court, I realized that the entire experience had been a masterclass in applied military skills for civilian challenges. The same capabilities that had kept me alive in Afghanistan had ultimately saved my business, protected my employees, and helped bring justice to dozens of families who had been victimized by professional criminals. Trevor's perfect crime had, indeed, changed everything for us, transforming what he intended to be my destruction into my greatest personal and professional triumph. His sophisticated conspiracy had been defeated by an opponent he had fundamentally misunderstood, and his careful planning had provided the very evidence that ensured his own lengthy imprisonment. The woman Trevor thought he could manipulate and destroy had instead become the instrument of justice that dismantled his entire criminal organization, proving that the most dangerous mistake any enemy can make is underestimating the capabilities of a well-trained soldier who refuses to surrender. 2 years after Trevor's sentencing, I found myself standing in the boardroom of the newly constructed Mitchell Veterans Business Center, looking out at a facility that represented everything Trevor had tried to destroy, but which had instead grown beyond anything I could have imagined during those dark months when I was fighting for my survival. The center housed not only the expanded headquarters of Mitchell & Associates Construction, but also served as a resource hub for veteran entrepreneurs throughout the Carolinas, providing business development services, security training, and fraud prevention education based on the lessons learned from my experience with Riverside Financial. The transformation of my life and business in the aftermath of Trevor's conspiracy had been profound and multifaceted, extending far beyond simple recovery to encompass new purposes and responsibilities that I had never anticipated. What began as a defensive operation to protect my company from criminal infiltration had evolved into a comprehensive mission to strengthen the entire veteran business community against sophisticated financial predators who viewed military families as particularly attractive targets. Mitchell & Associates had grown from a regional construction company to a significant player in federal contracting throughout the Southeast, with annual revenues approaching $8 million and a workforce of 67 employees, nearly all of whom were military veterans or family members of veterans. Our success had been built not only on the quality of our construction services, but also on our reputation for integrity, security awareness, and commitment to supporting fellow veterans in their transition to civilian entrepreneurship. The federal contracts we now held included major infrastructure projects for the Department of Veterans Affairs, facility construction for military installations, and specialized security installations for federal agencies that valued our unique combination of construction expertise and operational security awareness. Our military backgrounds and proven ability to handle sensitive projects had opened doors to opportunities that would have been impossible without the credibility we had gained during the Riverside financial investigation. But the most meaningful aspect of our expansion was the Mitchell Veterans Business Incubator, a program that provided comprehensive support for military veterans launching their own companies while protecting them from the kind of sophisticated fraud schemes that Trevor and his co-conspirators had perfected. The incubator offered not only traditional business development services, but also security training, financial fraud prevention, and background investigation assistance that helped veteran entrepreneurs identify and avoid potential threats to their operations. The incubator had been funded through a combination of sources that reflected the broad recognition of its importance. The Department of Veterans Affairs provided substantial grants for veteran business development, while the Small Business Administration contributed funding specifically designated for fraud prevention and security awareness programs. Private foundations focused on veteran services had also provided significant support, recognizing that protecting veteran entrepreneurs from financial crimes was a form of continued service to those who had served their country. Perhaps most significantly, the criminal asset forfeiture proceeds from the Riverside financial prosecutions had been awarded to our incubator program, ensuring that the money Trevor and his co-conspirators had stolen from veteran families would be used to protect future generations of military entrepreneurs from similar exploitation. Federal prosecutors had specifically requested this allocation, arguing that using the recovered assets to prevent future crimes represented the most appropriate form of justice for the victims who had been targeted by the conspiracy. The success stories emerging from our incubator program had been remarkable and deeply satisfying. Over the past 18 months, we had helped launch 37 veteran-owned businesses, ranging from technology startups to manufacturing companies to service organizations that employed more than 200 military veterans and family members throughout the region. More importantly, our security training and fraud prevention protocols had already identified and prevented at least 6 attempted infiltration operations targeting participants in our program. One particularly significant case involved a Marine Corps veteran named Michael Chen, who had developed an innovative cybersecurity technology with substantial commercial and military applications. Chen's company had been approached by investors who displayed many of the same psychological manipulation techniques and financial infiltration strategies that Trevor had employed against Mitchell and Associates. Our security protocols helped Chen recognize the warning signs and avoid what federal investigators later confirmed was an attempt to steal his intellectual property and frame him for industrial espionage. The federal law enforcement community had embraced our incubator program as a model for protecting veteran entrepreneurs while simultaneously gathering intelligence about criminal organizations that targeted military families. Special Agent Rodriguez, who had been promoted to supervise the FBI's Veterans Crime Task Force, worked closely with our security training programs to educate both law enforcement personnel and veteran business owners about emerging threats and effective countermeasures. The intelligence-sharing relationship with federal agencies had proven mutually beneficial, as our participants regularly provided information about suspicious approaches and potential fraud attempts that helped investigators identify new criminal networks before they could cause significant damage. This collaboration had resulted in the prevention of millions of dollars in potential losses, while helping federal agencies understand the evolving tactics being employed by sophisticated financial criminals. The psychological aspects of my recovery from Trevor's betrayal had been more complex than the practical elements of rebuilding my business and protecting other veterans from similar exploitation. Working with counselors who specialized in treating military veterans who had experienced civilian trauma, I had developed strategies for processing the emotional impact of systematic deception while maintaining the operational effectiveness that was crucial for my expanded responsibilities. The counseling process had helped me understand that Trevor's elaborate manipulation had been possible precisely because he had exploited the trust, loyalty, and service-oriented values that were fundamental to my identity as a military veteran. Rather than viewing these characteristics as vulnerabilities to be eliminated, I learned to see them as strengths that required better protective protocols rather than fundamental changes to my personality or approach to relationships. This understanding had been crucial for developing the fraud prevention training we provided to veteran entrepreneurs, as it allowed us to teach protective strategies without undermining the collaborative and trusting approaches that were essential for business success. Our programs emphasized verification procedures, financial oversight protocols, and relationship security measures that enhanced rather than replaced the interpersonal skills that military veterans brought to civilian business environments. The personal relationships in my life had been profoundly affected by the experience with Trevor, though not always in ways that might have been expected. My father, Detective Lieutenant Albert Morrison, had retired from the Newark Police Department and relocated to Charlotte, where he served as the chief security consultant for our incubator program. Our relationship had been strengthened by his recognition of how effectively I had applied the investigative skills he had taught me during my childhood. While my experience had validated his long-standing concerns about Trevor's character and motivations. My father's law enforcement expertise had been invaluable for developing the security protocols that protected our program participants, while his personal understanding of the emotional challenges involved in betrayal investigations had helped him provide the kind of support I needed during the most difficult phases of the legal proceedings. Working together on protecting other veterans had created a new foundation for our relationship that transcended the earlier conflicts about my marriage and life choices. The romantic aspects of my personal life had been more complicated to navigate, as the experience with Trevor had necessarily made me more cautious about trusting potential partners, while simultaneously making me more aware of the manipulation techniques that sophisticated criminals might employ. The counseling process had helped me develop strategies for building genuine relationships while maintaining appropriate security awareness. Though I had chosen to focus primarily on professional and community responsibilities, rather than pursuing serious romantic commitments. The media attention surrounding the Riverside financial case had created opportunities for broader public education about the financial crimes targeting military families, but it had also required careful management to protect the privacy and security of everyone involved in our programs. Working with public relations professionals who specialized in military and veteran issues, we had developed communication strategies that raised awareness about important security concerns while avoiding details that might help future criminals develop more effective infiltration techniques. The speaking engagements and media interviews I had conducted throughout the country had reached thousands of military families, business organizations, and law enforcement agencies with practical information about recognizing and preventing sophisticated fraud schemes. These presentations had been particularly valuable for military installations and veteran service organizations that needed to educate their communities about civilian financial threats that differed significantly from the security concerns military personnel encountered during their service. The academic community had also shown substantial interest in our case, with business schools and criminal justice programs requesting detailed information about the investigation techniques and prevention strategies that had been developed through our experience. Several universities had incorporated our materials into their curricula for courses on white-collar crime, business security, and veteran entrepreneurship, helping to educate future business leaders and law enforcement professionals about these important issues. The legislative impact of the Riverside financial case had been significant at both state and federal levels, with lawmakers recognizing the need for enhanced protections for veteran-owned businesses and stronger penalties for criminals who specifically targeted military families. Congressional hearings had examined the systematic vulnerabilities that made veteran entrepreneurs attractive targets for sophisticated financial crimes, while state legislatures had enacted new regulations governing business consulting and investment services that targeted veteran-owned companies. The Federal Trade Commission had implemented new disclosure requirements for investment advisors and business consultants who marketed their services to veteran entrepreneurs, while the Securities and Exchange Commission had enhanced oversight of financial products and services specifically promoted to military families. These regulatory improvements had been designed to make it more difficult for criminals to approach military veterans with fraudulent business opportunities while providing better resources for investigating and prosecuting related crimes. Looking toward the future, I could see that the mission of protecting veteran entrepreneurs from financial exploitation would require ongoing adaptation and expansion as criminal organizations developed new techniques and targeted different vulnerabilities. Within the military community, the Mitchell Veterans Business Center was already planning additional programs focused on cybersecurity threats, international business risks, and emerging technologies that might create new opportunities for sophisticated criminals. The collaboration with federal law enforcement agencies was expanding to include international components, as investigators had discovered that some criminal organizations targeting veteran-owned businesses had connections to foreign intelligence services and organized crime networks. These developments required enhanced security protocols and more sophisticated training programs that could address threats that extended beyond traditional financial crimes. The personal satisfaction I derived from this work was immense, as it represented a form of continued service to the military community that drew upon all of my professional skills and life experiences. The same capabilities that had enabled me to survive combat operations in Afghanistan were now being applied to protecting fellow veterans from criminal exploitation, while the lessons learned from Trevor's conspiracy were helping to prevent similar tragedies for other military families. The irony of Trevor's ultimate legacy was perfect and deeply satisfying. His sophisticated criminal conspiracy, designed to destroy my life and steal everything I had built through military service and veteran entrepreneurship, had instead become the foundation for a comprehensive mission that protected hundreds of military families while creating opportunities for thousands of veterans to build successful businesses in safe and secure environments. Trevor's perfect crime had indeed changed everything for us, transforming what he intended to be my destruction into a powerful force for justice and protection within the veteran community. His elaborate planning and criminal expertise had been defeated by an opponent he had fundamentally misunderstood, while his detailed documentation of his own crimes had provided the evidence necessary to build something far more valuable and enduring than anything he had hoped to steal. 5 years have passed since Trevor's arrest, and as I write this final chapter of my story, I'm sitting in the office that overlooks the construction site of our newest project. A 50-unit housing complex specifically designed for homeless veterans in downtown Charlotte. The irony isn't lost on me that we're building hope for veterans who lost everything, using a company that Trevor tried to steal, but which instead became stronger through his attempt to destroy it. Last month brought news that would have seemed impossible during those dark days when I was fighting for my survival. Trevor died in federal prison, not from violence or dramatic circumstances, but from a heart attack brought on by the stress and poor health that had plagued him throughout his incarceration. His death certificate listed his age as 42, but prison photographs showed a man who looked decades older, worn down by the weight of his crimes and the knowledge that he would never again experience freedom. Amanda Riverside had died 2 years earlier, also in federal custody, from complications related to diabetes that had gone untreated during her years of criminal activity. Marcus Brennan remained in prison, but had suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. Only David Walsh, Trevor's brother, was still capable of meaningful communication, and federal authorities reported that he spent most of his time writing letters to veteran organizations, apologizing for his role in targeting military families, and expressing genuine remorse for the pain their conspiracy had caused. The complete destruction of everyone involved in Riverside Financial's criminal enterprise provided a stark contrast to the flourishing success of everything they had tried to destroy. Mitchell and Associates Construction had grown into one of the largest veteran-owned construction companies in the Southeast, with annual revenues exceeding $15 million and a workforce of more than 100 employees. Our federal contracts now included major infrastructure projects throughout multiple states, while our reputation for integrity and security awareness had made us the preferred contractor for sensitive government installations. But the numbers only told part of the story. The Mitchell Veterans Business Center had become a regional model for protecting and supporting military entrepreneurs, with similar programs being established in 12 other states based on our protocols and training materials. Over the past 5 years, we had helped launch more than 200 veteran-owned businesses, creating employment opportunities for thousands of military families, while preventing dozens of attempted fraud schemes that might have destroyed lives and livelihoods. The most recent attempted infiltration had been particularly sophisticated, involving a criminal organization that had studied our public materials about the Riverside financial case and developed countermeasures designed to circumvent our security protocols. However, the same intelligence-gathering skills that had enabled me to defeat Trevor's conspiracy had evolved and improved through years of experience, allowing us to identify and neutralize this new threat before any of our program participants were harmed. Federal Agent Rodriguez, now the director of the FBI's National Veterans Crime Prevention Initiative, had visited our facility the previous week to discuss expanding our collaboration to include international components. Criminal organizations in several countries had apparently begun targeting American military veterans who were involved in overseas business ventures, requiring enhanced security awareness and more sophisticated protective measures. The personal aspects of my life had stabilized in ways that would have seemed impossible during the chaos of Trevor's betrayal. 3 years ago, I had married Captain James Morrison, a decorated Army Ranger who had transitioned to civilian life as a federal security consultant, specializing in counterterrorism and criminal investigation. Our relationship had developed, slowly and carefully, with both of us understanding the importance of trust, verification, and maintaining appropriate security awareness, even within intimate partnerships. James had been instrumental in developing the advanced security protocols that now protected our business operations and program participants. His experience with hostile intelligence operations and criminal infiltration techniques had complemented my own background, creating a comprehensive approach to threat assessment and risk management that had proven effective against increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations. Our marriage had produced a daughter, Emily Sarah Morrison, now 18 months old and already displaying the kind of determined independence that suggested she might follow in her parents' tradition of military service. Watching Emily play in the secure childcare facility we had established at our business center, surrounded by the children of other military veterans who were building successful businesses in safe environments, provided daily reminders of why our mission was so important and meaningful. The financial recovery from Trevor's conspiracy had been complete and substantial, but the most valuable assets we had gained were the knowledge, skills, and relationships that had emerged from confronting and defeating sophisticated criminal threats. The investigation techniques, security protocols, and fraud prevention strategies we had developed were now being used by military families, business organizations, and law enforcement agencies throughout the country. The educational components of our work had expanded to include comprehensive training programs for military personnel who were preparing to transition to civilian business careers. These programs addressed not only traditional business development topics, but also the specific security concerns and criminal threats that military veterans might encounter in civilian business environments. The training had been so successful that the Department of Defense had incorporated our materials into their standard transition assistance programs. Perhaps most significantly, our case had inspired changes in federal law that provided enhanced protections for veteran-owned businesses and stronger penalties for criminals who specifically targeted military families. The Veterans Business Protection Act, passed by Congress 18 months ago, included provisions that were directly based on our recommendations and the lessons learned from Trevor's conspiracy. The legislation had already resulted in dozens of additional prosecutions and had deterred numerous criminal organizations from targeting military entrepreneurs. The speaking engagements and media appearances that had grown out of our experience had reached millions of people with important information about financial security and fraud prevention. The book I had written about the investigation, titled Mission Counterintelligence, had become a bestseller within the military community and was being used as a training resource by law enforcement agencies and business organizations. The Quar television documentary about our case, produced by a major network with full cooperation from federal law enforcement agencies, had won several awards for investigative journalism while educating viewers about the sophisticated tactics being employed by criminals who targeted military families. The documentary had been particularly effective for reaching military spouses and family members who might not otherwise have access to formal security training. Looking back on the entire experience, from those first suspicious phone calls to Trevor's death in federal prison, I could see how each challenge had contributed to developments that ultimately strengthened and protected the entire veteran community. What had begun as a defensive operation to save my business had evolved into a comprehensive mission that had prevented countless tragedies while creating opportunities that benefited thousands of military families. The lessons learned from Trevor's conspiracy had applications that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of financial fraud and business infiltration. The investigation techniques, security awareness, and strategic thinking that had enabled me to defeat his scheme were valuable assets for addressing any situation where military veterans encountered civilian threats that differed from the challenges they had faced during their service. Most importantly, our experience had demonstrated that the skills, training, and values that defined successful military service were not only applicable to civilian challenges, but were often superior to conventional approaches for addressing sophisticated threats and complex problems. Military veterans possessed unique capabilities that, when properly applied and supported, could achieve remarkable results in business, law enforcement, and community protection. The legacy of Trevor's failed conspiracy was now a powerful force for justice and protection that would continue growing and evolving long after everyone involved in the original case had passed away. The programs, protocols, and partnerships we had developed were being replicated and improved by new generations of military veterans who understood the importance of protecting their communities from criminal exploitation. As I finished writing this account of our incredible journey, I reflected on how completely Trevor's perfect crime had backfired. His sophisticated plan to destroy my life had instead created something far more valuable and enduring than anything he could have stolen. His detailed documentation of criminal techniques had become the foundation for comprehensive prevention programs that protected thousands of families. His network of criminal accomplices had been transformed into evidence that strengthened law enforcement capabilities and enhanced legal protections for military families. Trevor thought he was so clever, but he never understood that his target was someone who had been trained to turn every attack into an opportunity for victory. His perfect crime became my perfect mission, and his downfall became the foundation for something beautiful and lasting that would protect generations of military families from the kind of predators who viewed our service and sacrifice as opportunities for criminal exploitation. If this story has resonated with you, if it's shown you something about the power of resilience, intelligence, and never giving up when your back is against the wall, then I hope you'll subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Tomorrow, I have another incredible story about justice served and the underestimated proving their true strength. These stories matter because they show us that no matter how sophisticated our enemies might be, no matter how perfect their plans appear, there's always a way to turn the tables when you have the skills, determination, and courage to fight back. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember, never underestimate what you're capable of when everything you've built is on the line. Your greatest victory might be waiting just on the other side of your greatest challenge.